Hi, I am Petra van Dam. I'm a professor of water and environmental history at the VU University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Today I'm going to tell about the amphibious culture of my country. I will show how we applied daily practices as coping mechanisms during disastrous floods. Why did we have floods? On the left hand, you see an image showing that the Netherlands were situated below sea level for at least half of the country, as it still does. It's the part to the left of the black line. On the right hand side, you see an image showing that the Netherlands were situated and are situated at the mouth of two rivers, the river Rhine and the river Meuse. Now these rivers can carry a lot of water, especially when the snow is melting in the mountains or when there is lots of rain in the upper parts of the rivers. So that's a cause for flooding. Another cause is storm surges at sea. Then the water comes from the sea. I have indicated with a red circle the place where these two phenomena would or could appear at the same time. Very high water at sea and very high water in the rivers, and that was the most vulnerable area where flooding and breaking dikes occurred about once per generation. How do we measure the scale of a flood disaster? What is a big disaster? What is a small disaster? Before 1800, this is rather difficult. Usually people count the number of people and the number of cattle that have died. Another way is counting the financial damage to buildings, to bridges, to roads, to dikes, and to cattle. And yet another way is simply counting the surface flooded. That's what you see on this image. This historical geographer called Mrs. Gottschalk has indicated for each famous flood how large the areas were that were flooded. We've had very many floods, but a few have become very famous. They were very large floods when we lost a lot of land, or indeed land was changed into sea and never recovered, or we lost a lot of people, or both. On this slide I list the most famous floods. An example is the St. Elizabeth flood of 1421, and in 1424 almost in the same area a similar flood appeared in the same month, and therefore it carries the same name. St. Elizabeth in 1570, you see All Saints flood. In 1770 you see the Christmas flood. Often floods were called after a special day. They occurred at this day or very close to this day, and these were days that were commemorative days of particular Christian saints. I also indicated the type of records on this slide. For a historian it's important to understand how we know something, what kind of document tells us about the flood. In 1421 we have parish records. That means that we have quite precise numbers of people who lived in particular villages. So we know if the entire village is destroyed, we also know that all the people are either dead or they have fled. In 1717 we have a much better source. That's an administration at the level of the province, which was very precise, and therefore for this date we know very exactly what the number of deaths were. To my opinion, the most salient feature of our more than 1,000 years of flood history is that we actually had very few casualties. I mean, 2,000 people is 2,000 lives, But if we look at other countries, for instance in China, then a couple of hundreds of thousands casualties from a flood is not unusual and may even go into the millions. So 2000 is very small. And yet these were the largest floods. Many other floods had only a couple of dozens or a couple of hundreds of casualties. How do we explain this? The research question for today is, how did people cope with floods once dikes were broken, taken into account that so many survived? Were these coping mechanisms maybe very successful? For understanding how people coped with the floods, I made a model which I called the amphibious culture. It has three characteristics. First of all, the landscape was made up into compartments because it had many interior dikes. Secondly, people lived at elevations, at high places, which gave them time during a flood to evacuate the houses, or simply they retreated to their houses and churches because they were safe there. Thirdly, people could use water-based transport because they had boats. So either they stayed or they left, and they could be evacuated fairly easily, and not only them but also their cattle. I now start with the first section of the talk about compartments. This slide explains how compartments came about. Top left, A, natural levees. The thick blue line is a river. This is the river Rhine. A river creates higher and lower grounds all around it by sedimentation, and people settle on the higher grounds. These are the black spots, the villages. At times of high water, for instance when the snow was melting in the mountains, the water would go around their houses. That's what you see in picture B. The blue areas are the water of the rivers. After some time, say some decades, some generations, people expand their agricultural grounds, and they don't want anymore that those grounds flood in early summer, for instance. And that's why they start building the small, short dikes, the red lines. Gradually, these lines grow into long dikes. And then we turn to picture C. This is where all along the rivers you see a black line, and that is all the small dikes grown into big dikes. But inside the land also small dikes appear. That's the next slide. Here I show the same area, and I want to explain how the side dikes turned into compartment dikes. So here is the example of the Diefdijk. Top left you see the Diefdijk in the landscape of today, but it was actually formed in around the year 1284. As you can see on the picture below in the map, this dike connects the main river dike of the river Lek with a main river dike of another river, the river Linge. And what is the great advantage of this new dike? And that you can see in the small picture in the middle. Here the dike is broken somewhere up to the right. The water floods in between the river dikes, but only until this Diefdijk that runs from north to south. So this is what we call a compartment. The water stays within a certain area. To the left you see this in a schematic way. Making compartments is a very classical way of mitigating disasters. For instance, in shipbuilding the same technique is used. A large seagoing vessel has compartments below deck, so if a hole occurs in the side of the ship, only one compartment is filled with water and the ship still floats. And here the same principle is applied to the land. The previous slide was about compartment dikes in the river area in the south of the Netherlands. Here we have a part in the north of the Netherlands, a very different part. This is a piece of land sticking out into the sea. And at the left side are higher grounds, the coastal sand dunes. From here, the people moved towards the sea. Every time when the sea made some new land by sedimentation, they will put a small dike around it and turn it into pasture or land for agriculture. And during the next 2 or 3 generations, they would wait again and then make a new piece of land. So a very gradual way of land making. And these little sea dikes then became interior dikes when a new part of land was added. So you would say, once the big sea dike was there, and at this map it is the very thick black line, you don't need those interior dikes anymore. However, they were kept because each part of land had a slightly different level. So these interior dikes served for the interior water management. However, when the land was flooded because of a dike breach, as you see here in 1675, then these small interior parts functioned as compartments. So here you see very well that in 1675, on the 5th of November, only the middle part was flooded, and then 2 weeks later, on the 16th of November, some more parts, and then at the 5th of December, again some more parts. So this was a very slow flooding, and the people living in all these villages and in single farms out in the countryside, they had lots and lots of time to take care, to pack their belongings and evacuate. Section 2. Elevations. Several types of elevations existed and exist in the Netherlands. First of all, natural elevations. The sea and the rivers made elevations by means of sedimentation. The sea, for instance, made the sand dunes that you see here in the upper picture to the left, that yellow bit, but also the rivers made higher grounds, as I said before. And on top of that, there were human-made elevations. People built dikes along the rivers, as under number 2 in the picture, and they built dams, as under number 8, and they built house mounds. And these house mounds you find in the lower picture where I say house on mount. Now what happened when the dike broke? As you can see in the lower picture, in the middle the dike is broken and the sea invades the land. All the houses standing on elevations are quite safe. The higher elevations, like the dunes in the background where you see the church, those are the most safe places. The dunes are up to 20 meters above sea level. Then here on the dikes, the large White House, for instance, is very safe. That's about 2 to 3 meters above sea level, and that's sufficient. In the inland, you see a red house on a mount. That's still safe, although the water is very close, but the water won't rise anymore. For once the water is inside the land, it spreads out. There's only relatively a small amount of water flooding through the hole in the dike, and it spreads out over hundreds of square kilometers. So the total level of the water in the inland is maybe 1 or 2 meters. However, you also see some houses that are submerged. They are standing on the soil directly. They're not standing on house mounds, and therefore they are submerged until the roof. Some houses stood on house mounds, but often the center of a village, and certainly the center of towns, were elevated. up to 3 or 4 meters above sea level. Here the house mounds had grown together to form one big village or town mound, so to say. Apart from that, churches were often situated on their own house mound, which would even be higher than the town or the village mound. So here you see a beautiful example to the left from the village of Oostum, a church built in 1250, that's in the Central Middle Ages. It's still there, and you can see how high it is above the fields. And to the right you see a church of the 17th century, and the picture is taken in 1916 during a large flood, because this type of church served as a shelter. Here people who were maybe living in small poor houses that were not built on house mounds, they could find a shelter, and they would take their cattle with them. As you see in the picture above, that is a very similar church, similar architecture. And in the pulpit, a very specially a phenomenon, you see that they stored the hay for the cattle. In the middle picture to the bottom, it's the same year, 1916, and you see here the cattle again in the church. Not only did people build their houses, their barns, their farms on house mounds, they could also make special adaptations to the architecture of the farms. Here to the left you see a farm with two doors, a door in the center and a door at the left. Now the door at the left is the normal door for normal times. When the countryside was flooded, they would use the middle door that is much higher. So the water would rise until about this door, which is about 1.5 meters above the soil, and the people would arrive by boat, connect their boat to the wall with some hook or so, and they would enter that door, and they would live in the upper stories of the house. And the door to the left and the windows there, which are part of the kitchen, that room would be flooded and they would not use that. To the right you see a small barn for cattle, and here too the doors are slightly elevated, and you can see that the wooden part of the barn is built on a brick part. The basic idea is the water does not rise higher than the brick part, so the cattle that is in this barn, maybe it will get wet feet, but it will survive. The next section is about water transport and evacuation. The third characteristic of the model of the amphibious culture is about having a boat. In the Netherlands, every farm was also a skipper. Very many people had boats because water was everywhere, canals, ditches, lakes, rivers, and transport over water is much cheaper and easier than transport over land in the pre-industrial period. Here you see one sailing boat. There is a little person sitting in there. Maybe this was the boat belonging to this farm. To the right of the main building you see a small roof above the ditch. This is typical of a protection for a small boat. You can say this is a type of boat garage. And from the boat garage to the farm you see a path. So from the front door there is a direct connection to this boat, showing how important this boat is. This is a very special picture. It is painted on a map dating from 1550. That is about the oldest type of pictures that have survived in the Netherlands, and it is a very rare picture. It has been preserved as part of a book, an administrative register of a hospital that owned grounds in the vicinity of the city of Leiden, and because it was inside the book it has been preserved so well. As I said, everybody had a boat, but there was also public transport by boats. To the top left you see a painting by Van der Velde, the pond of 1622, depicting a pond. So this was a ferry carrying people and cattle from one side of the river to the other. So this is using boats in normal times. All the other pictures show smaller and bigger boats used to evacuate people from flooded houses and flooded territories. So these are very dramatic scenes where you see people lifting their hands for help and swimming in the water or trying to swim with all lots of things floating around them. So these are really disastrous events, and yet there is also something reassuring in the middle picture about the zeevang of 1775. Here you see a farmer with his 2 or is it 3 heads of cattle in a fairly small boat crossing the water to where? Probably to one of those churches I've showed. So this was the way to do it. When the water arrived, you took your cattle and your belongings, put them on a boat and moved to the next highest place. This is another and very famous presentation of what happens during a flood. To the left you see a painting, we don't know the painter, of the end of the 15th century, showing the big flood of 1421, the St. Elizabeth flood. At the top right you see the water flowing through the broken dike, and in the picture everywhere you see people either walking with goods and cattle or sitting in a boat, and they move up to the city of Dordrecht, which is at your left hand and you can't see it very well. There is another painting which depicts the people in the city of Dordrecht. At the right you see a similar scene, but then a reinterpretation of the 18th century. It's more dramatic. You see the force of the wind depicted in the moving of the branches of the tree and in the moving of the air. So this is a more of a what we call a romantic period, so a different type of presentation, but the sort of facts it tells are the same. Here in the middle you see a boat with people, and on the tower of the church you see people sitting waiting for boats to evacuate them to higher grounds. In my last section I want to give a very short comparison with Asia. I did a small research project in the area called Tonkin, that's in the northeast of Vietnam, and that is the area of the Red River. Here polders exist too, like in the Netherlands. So there is parts of land encircled by dikes in the river mouth. And how do these work? This is a map of the inundation of 1916, a very large flood when the dikes broke in the environment of Ha Dong, or Hanoi as is it called today, the capital of Vietnam. And the blue parts of this map represent the water flooding from north to south. So to the left of the river all the land is flooded, and there were huge numbers of casualties. We don't know exactly, but this probably went into hundreds of thousands. But to the right of this river all this yellow land is dry, and that is because the dikes here provided enough cover. For instance, here in the south you see the province of Tay Binh. That is really encircled by this red line, which is the dike. These images I received from a colleague from Thailand, Rongviri Yavanich. She made photographs in 2010 of the great flood in the capital of Bangkok. Now, what we can see here is a large difference between the past and the present. To the right, you see the past as depicted in scenes on the walls of temples in Thailand. There is a lot of water, and the people have moved to the second story of their house. But they seem rather happy. They are even swimming in the water, they are going in and out of boats, and there is not a real disaster. They are quite adapted to the high water, and that's very typical for Thailand. To the left, at the top, we still see a similar situation at the beginning of the 20th century. So people move up in their houses like they did in the river area in the Netherlands, and life continues. Life is very much adapted, and I call that it's very amphibious. It's like animals who move from wet to dry parts of the land without problems. That's how the people lived. They were amphibious. However, on the left, at the bottom, you see a very recent flooding, that is 2010. And here we do not see boats, but we see cars that are almost drowned. And that is certainly not a very practical way of moving in the water. So here we see that the city of Bangkok is getting less and less amphibious, so to say. They are losing their amphibious way of life. Now, to conclude this presentation, I want to summarize. Before about 1850, that is before the industrial era, we had an amphibious culture. It implies that we had specific cultural adaptations in daily life, contributing to coping with flood disasters. And three characteristics stand out. The landscape was subdivided into compartments, and that means that floods occurred relatively slowly, and people and even their animals had time to retreat, either to higher parts in their buildings or to higher parts in the landscape. And that is number two. Elevations in the landscape served as isles. They stood out above the water. They could provide temporary shelters, as in churches. And of course, these islands also served as centers for rescue, taking out the remaining people from the flooded countryside. And after the flood, from these islands, reconstruction could start. First of all, the dikes had to be reconstructed, and then the fields had to be sown again, and the buildings repaired, and life could go on. Characteristic 3 is water-based transport. Because humans used boats, all different types of boats, in daily life anyway, they had access to boats in times of floods. Now, what happened after the 1850s about in the Netherlands, I did not tell about that, but I can summarize it for you. We lost this amphibious attitude, as is now happening in Thailand and other places in the world. So by now, almost nobody has a boat anymore. We're not living only in elevations, especially large parts of cities are built on the very low grounds, and if the dikes would break, they would flood very easily. And we just rely on the dikes. We have built up an enormous trust in our water defense system, and we expect that the dikes will never break. But if they would, we would be in much larger problems than we were ever in the past. And that's why I call this era after the amphibious culture maybe the terrestrian era. This is the area that we're not amphibious anymore, and that we have become real terrestrian humans. People relying on the ground, sitting on the ground and not able to move over the water. I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and in this slide I point out some important publications about the amphibious culture and my homepage that you can reach for other publications. Thank you and bye-bye.